update the board on the budget. This provides an opportunity for the board's information and discussion.
Welcome.
Good evening, President Rohde, Superintendent Thompson, members of the board, Dr. Irving. I don't know about all of you, but I thought tonight's meeting was very inspiring. I thought hearing about our wonderful teachers getting nominated for their awards was outstanding. Our students have done some just tremendous work. I thought the work on the Gemini 2 project was exciting, and so was the Bryant project. And so what does budget have to get excited about? Well, we get to get excited about tax revenues. But that is good news. The sun is shining in Kansas concerning its tax revenues. So we'll start there tonight. Our state has exceeded revenue projections for the past 9 consecutive months. So that is good news in stark contrast to where we sat at this time last year, when the state was forecasting a budgetary deficit of almost $600 million for fiscal year 18. So while it's not quite as exciting as some of the other things we've heard tonight, it is extremely good news for our state and its financial situation. The state has exceeded revenue estimates since November in a total of $270 million, and some additional good news for our state related to federal tax reform. Our state should benefit from those changes, exceeding $500 million over the next 3 years. About $140 for fiscal year 19, $180 fiscal year 20, and close to $190 million fiscal year 21. The takeaway here, I think, for the board is the state does have funds to address Gannon 5 without raising taxes. So that is something that as we watch these next few weeks at the legislative level, it will be very interesting to see how the state legislature handles these additional revenues that it has as it formulates its next steps in the school finance challenge. The unfortunate news, if you will, is that really relatively nothing has happened related to school finance since the legislative session started in January. We have been on kind of a holding pattern while the legislature waits for the new cost study from Dr. Lori Taylor. That study is due out Thursday. I think it will be midnight when the report actually gets released. And then it will be really a fast and furious race to April 6th, which is the first adjournment date. And I think that's where we'll see a lot of action taking place. In fact, we're probably going to go from 0 to 100 in about a 3-week period, with the study being released Thursday night. The 2 attorneys, one representing the House, one the Senate, will be working all night to make presentations to the education committees on that Friday, March 16th. Dr. Taylor herself presents on March 19th, and then the first adjournment being April 6th. It is my understanding that the legislature is targeting a possible finance formula solution before they go out for first adjournment. So they're hoping to have something to the governor by the April 6th adjournment. We'll see how well they do. If that timeline holds, then the Supreme Court timeline goes as follows. April 30th, briefs are due. May 10th, responses are due to those briefs. May 22nd is the date for oral arguments, and the Supreme Court has promised a decision by June 30th. So we have the legislative timeline that's working through that April 6th date, and then we have the Supreme Court deadline timeline that will follow. There's a few things that can happen, so we'll just kind of talk through the possibilities. Dr. Taylor's study very well may show numbers less than previous cost studies. I don't know that the legislature would have hired her if they thought it was going to be more. So I think they're banking on her coming in with something less. If that's the proposal they build their school finance formula around, and that's the governor signs that, it goes before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agrees, then we could have a school finance formula in place and operational by June 30th. That is an option. If the Supreme Court rejects that finance formula that is built on the Taylor study, Then there's several options that might happen after that. The Supreme Court rules in time for the legislature to go back, perhaps in special session, and fix before June 30th. That's a possibility. The Supreme Court could grant an extension to the June 30th date, having the legislature come back to special session, and we get an adjustment to the finance formula. But the third option we've not talked about too much this year is the possibility that because the court in Gannon 5 had very strong language about how it wanted to proceed with this particular finance formula coming back to them, a shutdown in July is not outside the realm of possibility. So I think we just need to as we watch these happenings over the next few weeks, these what-if questions are going to become a little bit more important to us as far as planning of what might happen depending on what comes out in the Taylor study and what action the legislature takes. In the meantime, we are doing the work of the budget. We have school budgets out, and they are due back to us March 29th. Our program budgets are due back April 9th, and then we're kind of the final collection of data due back on May 7th. So that's kind of our internal budget timeline. We have identified several fiscal year 19 needs to date, and we are in the process of costing these out. But just to kind of run through this list quickly, will have the expenses related to the school calendar change. That's the action of adding the 15 days back, reducing the day from 7.5 hours to 7 hours. There will be expenses associated with that change. The transportation contract, I think I've mentioned that before. That's a fixed cost increase. Our electric and water utilities are both anticipated to go up, as well as some technology contract increases. We'll need to address compensation for staff within our budget. That goes to our recruitment and retention initiatives that the board had set out as a priority last year. And in addition, we're looking at early childhood needs. We've already identified several pre-K early childhood enrollment increase needs, which would indicate we would need more classrooms in those areas. Continued expansion of the learning centers, that goes to our graduation rate work. And then the expenses related to the behavior continuing services, one of those being the Bryant Initiative that you heard from tonight. We'll need to put some final numbers to that and bring that back for board consideration. So that's just kind of what we've identified so far. Those numbers and needs are still coming in. We're trying to align, for the most part, with what we identified last year as budget priorities, and that's why I put the identifiers in parentheses so we could kind of have that information. But also, as we're listening to some of the board work related to the strategic plan, we're trying to kind of put those into those big bucket categories so that when you are doing your work on April 9th related to the strategic plan, we're able to come in behind that work and kind of categorize, here's what we heard you say is important within the strategic plan, here's what we're thinking is your priority list with those very important goals, and then what falls underneath with some help to kind of prioritize that work. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to kind of capitalize on all the work you've been doing as it relates to fiscal year 19 budget planning. So just kind of in closing, our budgetary next steps, certainly we're going to be keeping a close eye on legislative action. Several of us may be in Topeka next week as things are starting to happen. We should have a lot to share with you on April 9th related to what's happened. We will be collecting that data to put some numbers to those fixed cost increase estimates, and then we will be working through the budget priorities with your April 9th strategic plan work. Our takeaways tonight related to budget, increasing state revenues indicate there is funding available to answer the Gannon 5 case without a tax increase. Legislative action around school finance should be picking up at lightning speed, so we'll hold on to our chairs and hope for the best. Fiscal year 19 budget development is in progress and continues while we await our school finance formula, and those budgetary needs are being identified and will be brought back to the board for consideration and prioritization. And that's our speed presentation tonight, and do you have any questions?
We'll start with Stan.
Just a real quick question.
and either Dr. Thompson or Ms. Willis could try to answer it, but when we put on here identified needs of fiscal year 19, expenses related to social emotional work, and like the Bryant, is that also including, are we anticipating the fact, there's been a lot of talk about counseling work? Is that included in that area?
Absolutely. All
Okay.
our work that's kind of falls under that category, where we want to expand that beyond what we've done in fiscal year 18. We did quite a bit of work. We need to do more. That would be, all of that would be encompassed under that category.
I thought it was. I
Yes.
just want to make sure that was definitely on the radar. Okay.
I have a question. With the timeline that you just presented to us, it makes me a little bit worried that the state legislators are going to go at too fast a pace and run over some things that shouldn't be run over. I'm making the guess that we have stopgaps to make sure that we point those out when they show up, or do we have a list of what needs to be, or?
We do. Of course, we've got a kind of a legislative bill tracker system. So every bill that comes up on the floor, we're tracking how does that impact us? What stakeholders need to engage in that process and determine, do we want to go up and speak out against or for a particular bill? So that action is all occurring basically daily at this point. We were up last week testifying on a transportation issue. There's one on the LOB that will be next week we may go up and testify on. So all of that's kind of happening in the background, in addition to some of the action they're taking to address the equity issues related to the funding formula. The removing the 10% floor, changing the cap on bonds, all of that work is kind of ongoing and happening, and we're watching that very carefully.
And the busing issue, it makes me have a question about, they talked about us having extra $3 million this year, and we're going to increase our busing because of our changing calendar by 15 days. How's that going to affect us? Are we going to need to be worried about that, or is there any conversation about that yet?
The House bill last week, and the number fails me at the moment, but we went up and testified as a proponent of the bill because it was basically putting into law the longstanding past practice, which would ensure the $3 million of funding that we've been receiving in how KSD was implementing the transportation formula would be protected. There were about 25 to 30 school districts that testified in favor of the bill. There was no one actually that spoke out against it. Even the Kansas Policy Institute was neutral, which was interesting. So I think we're on fairly solid ground related to transportation. In fact, I think the fact that most schools are already underfunded related to their transportation expenses was a powerful message that continuing to erode that funding just creates problems within the general fund. I think we got our message across.
Thank you. Ernestine.
There are other funding buckets that are going to be going after some of this extra money. Do we have any assurance that there really will be $600,000 for us? I mean, for the schools.
600 million?
Yeah, $600 million for the schools.
I think the common belief right now is there is money to phase in a $600 million increase to school funding over a 3-year period, which potentially would leave funds for other needs, certainly. There are other tax pieces they're looking at. Internet sales tax is one piece that would raise $60 million. So there are several things kind of working that would potentially drive a little bit more revenue. But yes, you are correct in that it would be, it wouldn't be outside the realm of possibility that because of other budget needs, that may be a reason not to fund public education in the amount that the State Board of Education feels is necessary to meet the Rose standards. That will be the battle, I think, that gets fought at the legislative level, is how much, when there are so many needs, is devoted to K-12. You know, we know what we need related to what the State Board has said, what the legislative post-audit said, what the Augenmeyer and Blick study said. Taylor's study could come in support of that, could come in at something less. Interest alone on those two older studies, you would think we'd be pretty safe, that the state board numbers are solid, but I think you're right, it's going to be a battle.
Isn't it sad that we have, in effect, all of these poor children holding the buckets, each of them having been cut in the past, and now they're all needing some help. Even the roads. That's all.
You just want to wave your magic money wand and fix all of these problems.
But I do think the fact that the Supreme Court is sitting there watching, and they seemed, as you made the point, to be very, very stern, that they've had this thing bouncing and bouncing and bouncing for many years. And I think that at this point, there is some sternness there that maybe will make, anyway, thank you.
Ben?
It's more of a comment, but just tying it back to the beginnings of our strategic planning work about civic engagement. And these next 4 weeks is an excellent time for students, staff using home email, board members, other members of the community that are listening to contact your state legislator in the next 3 weeks or so, letting them know your thoughts on public education finance. I don't think they hear it often enough. And so you never know who's a public education advocate in the state legislature, so send it anyway.
Cheryl?
Yes, I agree with you. I think the next 3 weeks is going to be our telling time. We're going to have a much clearer picture by this time next month. But with that said, there has been talk, and of course no one knows for sure what the Supreme Court will do or not do, but there has been talk about phasing it in over time. So some of that extra revenue, we wouldn't necessarily have to take it all from the state if they did that. And would that could be built into the state's plan? Is that how they would do that?
Right, that's exactly what would happen.
Okay. My second question is, not tonight, but maybe within the next month when we know more. It scares me if we have to go back and have the legislature called back in, and that number 3 on there, the possibility of a shutdown in July. And at that point, I think sometime in the not far future, but close future, we need to be talking to our staff about making sure they get their checks in the lump sum as opposed to sending it out over the summer, because it would kill my soul if some of our teachers didn't get their checks in July and August.
Right, and we did that, I mean, actually, we've become quite the broken record in some respects, as far as, we go out in March with our notification, we close it in April, and then we go back in May saying, okay, here's what we think might happen, so we're gonna open it back up and allow you to make a change. Certainly, I think we have teachers that really need the lump sum option, and then we have those teachers that much prefer to budget a check at a time. So when we give those teachers that prefer the once a month payment, a lump sum, it can be a little problematic. So we will probably try to wait as long as we can, but still giving them ample time to make that decision. So to your point, I think once we get through these next few weeks, we see if we get a formula to the governor by the April 6th date. If it doesn't look to be what we think the Supreme Court would agree meets the Rose standards, then absolutely we're going to come in with a communication to our teachers saying, here's the risk and maybe you should consider that.
That's what I would like,
Absolutely.
and opening that up in May so that they still have an opportunity to
Right.
change. Because I know that comes very early
It
when they
does.
have to make that call.
Yes.
So, thanks.
Ernestine?
Well, I just want to piggyback on what Ben was saying, is because a lot of people say, oh, well, they'll never listen to me at the legislature. And the interesting truth is that if a legislator receives 6 communications on the same topic, the legislator thinks it's almost a landslide. That's because so few people ever contact their state legislators. So in Topeka, they've got a telephone, they've got email, and whatever, whichever side of the issue you want to write about or email about, they pay attention. They really do. And right now, I think we've got a legislature that really is friendly to kids and friendly to schools. And so I'm wanting, in effect, to say, we're going to cheer you when you do the right thing. Now, that's a political statement, I know, but
You want me to bang my hammer at you? Susan, you make finance fun. Thank you very much. Mike, next item.
Under miscellaneous, Superintendent